the question of like, okay, so what were you guys eating? What were they eating? What tools did they have, and then what was sort of the progression? What did that do for us as early humans and our progress into today?
That's a really good question. So one couple really quick things I think to preload that this part of the conversation. One thing we have to remember is that our ancestors were not surviving, and that was one thing that we had. One of the discussions or the points of contention that we had with everybody doing the show and producing a show and all this, and us out there, was that they kind of, I mean, it's TV. They wanted to see us suffering. I mean, they wanted the ratings. They wanted to see us pissy. They wanted to see us cursing. They wanted to see us wet and miserable and covered in bugs and all these other sorts of things, and starving. And the reality, and I kept saying, that's not the right image to present. That isn't the way that it was. Now, first, listen, don't get me wrong. There were a lot of people that died. I mean, everybody at some point died in over 3.5 million years. And a lot of people died very tragically. A lot of people died because they starved, and a lot of people were sick and because they were malnourished. But those were outliers. The story of our evolutionary past is not one of, Australopithecines 3.5 million years ago, 3.5 feet tall, brains the size of my fist, just kind of getting by and making it for 3.5 million years. And if it was that, okay. No, it's a story of spreading around the world, increasing population size, most importantly, having the nutrition to support massive body and brain growth over time. That isn't a story of our species surviving, right? They're not naked and afraid. That is a story of our species getting so much incredible nutrition into their bodies that they can support all of these things and continuing to do it better and better and better and better. Our ancestors were not surviving. They weren't even subsisting. They were thriving. That was a story I wanted to tell to that show. I don't think it came across so well, but that is the story. That's the picture that we really should have in our minds. So the tools that to get back to your question, the tools that our ancestors created were so incredibly powerful. They weren't, the kinds of, they weren't microchips, they weren't the space shuttle, they weren't those kind of things, but they were just as, if not more powerful in what they allowed our ancestors to do. And it really, if you think about it, it breaks down, and the tools and the technologies they created break down into two major categories. One is that they allowed us to overcome our physical limitations and access increasingly diverse and incredible resources from our environment. And then number two, once we had those resources that we couldn't just get with our nails and our teeth and our muscles or whatever, once we had those resources, then these other technologies allowed us to do something to those resources, whether or not they were something we were designed to eat. In almost all cases they weren't. We could convert them and transform them into something that we could derive incredible nutrition from. So things like stone tools, fire, pottery, digging sticks, butchering tools. Those are the kind of things that I'm talking about. Very simple, very, very simple, but powerful. Because one of the examples I usually give is when we made our first stone tool 3.3 million years ago. In less than a second, our Australopithecine ancestors struck two rocks together and created an edge, a razor sharp edge that was stronger and sharper than any part of our body. And when it did get dull, they could do it again and make it again in less than a second. And that completely transformed our relationship, with our environment. But the other quick takeaway, I think, from those two categories of technology surrounding food, and I think one that your audience would really get a lot of use from, is that almost all, up until the agricultural revolution, so everything changes at 10 to 12,000 years ago, but for the entirety of millions of years, almost every technology surrounding, including animals in our diets, had something to do with getting the animal. I mean, our biggest issue with having access to meat or organs or blood or fat or whatever is actually overcoming our physical limitations and getting that animal, right? That's the hard part, right? So we created bows and arrows and atlatls and boomerangs in Australia and the throwing sticks and those sorts of things, boomerangs, nets and traps and fishing hooks and all of those things that we did to get the animals. But once we have that animal, all we need is a sharp edge, and we can cut it open. Sure, we can cook some of it if we want. Meat does seem to have there's a little bit of a nutritional benefit to just a little bit cooking meat, but otherwise, if you have a dead animal in front of you and a sharp edge, all of that incredible massive nutrition that's sitting there in that pile is not only safe, but incredibly nutrient dense and incredibly bioavailable. All you got to do is start diving in. So the technologies for millions of years surrounding animals were about getting the animal. Plants, completely different. It's the exact opposite. Almost all the technologies involved with including plants in our diet, other than, again, basically maybe a digging stick to get roots or something sharp to maybe cut something off of a tree, almost all the technologies were about taking that raw material and getting it ready for our bodies, because every single plant on this planet has toxins. And even when they do have nutrition, that nutrition is incredibly difficult for our bodies to have access to. So there's been a lot of energy and time and deliberate technological innovation trying to detoxify plants and make the nutrition in those plants available to our bodies. And I think that's a huge, huge distinction.
Yeah, and that's another question too, because obviously that's something that everyone has a hard time with now, especially when pushing vegan and plant based, being like, oh my goodness, no, we're in the Garden of Eden, we just eat. This is the bounty from God, and this is just all for us. And but this is something that's quite well established in botany and horticulture and all these other things. In fact, that's just biologically how plants defend themselves, is by being toxic physically. I mean, they have other defenses as well, but that's a major one. So when did people start, sort of dipping into, the plant kingdom to start eating? And obviously they had to do more work to get that. And I think I was talking to Dr. Mickey Bendor, and he was saying that he looked at this from like a economic point of view, because he had a history in economics before he did his PhD in paleoanthropology. And he said, like, just economically, like, it doesn't make sense. Like, why would you eat plants? You get 10 times the return for your investment, eating animals, And so at what point did that shift where we started eating more plants, or how do we know? Like, what was the evidence for that?
Well, first off, I love Mickey Bendor's work. I absolutely love it. And he's adding a voice to the anthropological community that really needs to be there. One thing I'd like to say before we dive in really deep into this is archaeology is not a hard science, right? It's not like biology or chemistry or physics or anything like that. We have a lot of numbers. We do a lot of measurements. We draw things and have great graphs. But at the end of the day, every level of archaeological interpretation is a hypothesis, right? Even down to what a tool should be called and how it should be used. And there's no way that we can take out the biases in the archaeologists or the anthropologists that are trying to, including myself, obviously. When we look at you take the same archaeology and put it on a table, and 10 different people could interpret 10 different things. And there's a lot of things can help create those biases, right? And a lot of it has to do with how the archaeologists themselves view the world. A lot of archaeological interpretation, there's a lot of amazing archaeology taking place in the 40s and the 50s for a lot of different reasons, in 60s, 70s, obviously. It's not a very old discipline. Modern archaeology really is about 100, 130 or so years old. And we've learned a lot. We've learned a ton. But a lot of in the mid 20th century, there was a lot of archaeology being done. And think about it, like Indiana Jones. I mean, archaeology, Indiana Jones, World War II. Think about what's going on in the world at that time, especially when we're talking about American archaeologists. We have a lot of, everybody had troops all over the world, but America had a lot of troops over, and we were planning these victory gardens. I mean, in the conscience of the country, everybody wanted to do something to help the war effort. What can we do if we can't go fight? What do? We have meatless days, and we have victory gardens. We're going to help our sons win the war because we're planting carrots in our backyard for some reason. But truly, our conscience was really plant focused. Plants were helping us win the war. Plants were helping us do these things. We were helping the war effort when we didn't eat meat in our house. and there were obviously shortages and these sorts of things as well. And there's no doubt that that mindset, that way we viewed the world and what we should be eating and what we should be accomplishing and all these other sorts of things made its way into archaeological interpretation. And a lot of the standard texts and a lot of the archaeological what resources that people go to were really written at that time. Some of the most famous archaeologists are from that time period. And plants became a huge focus. Everybody was looking for who was eating plants and how they were eating plants. And, they were figuring things out, like optimal foraging theory based on foraging patterns. And we had Yule Gibbons, one of the first, foragers, who was writing about foraging and in books that made it all over the world in the 60s and the 70s. Then we had the 70s where plants were a huge focus. So, for decades, were the basis of a lot of the archaeological interpretation that forms what we're taught in college classrooms still today is from that time period. So plant focused. We were doing everything we could to find out how people were eating plants, and we weren't giving enough credit to hunting. We weren't giving enough credit to animals. So somebody like Miki Bandor's voice now is a strong, incredible voice that's helping to even out that conversation. It's difficult to see plants in the archaeological record for obvious reasons, because they're so incredibly, they can be destroyed so easily through natural processes. We can see them though, especially we can see a lot of plant microfossils, things like phytoliths, which are little silica bodies that form in plants, and their morphology, their shape is different depending on the plant that they're from, and they get stuck in pores of rocks, starch grains, and other sorts of things that we can find on tools that were used to process plants. But we're really only talking about going back 6, 7, 8, 9,000 years with some of these plant microfossils, and able to understand how they were dealing with plants and how they made a difference in the diet. So it's difficult to see plants back 2 million years at the time periods that we're talking about. So let's put that aside for a second. What I do think we really need to understand is that, and listen, I eat primarily animal foods. I'm not full carnivore, but I'm damn close to it. And the plants that I eat, I'm making sure that I either anything that has a high toxin load I can't deal with, I don't eat. And when they, in other cases, I'll either be detoxifying them or processing them properly. But just before I start this next piece, I want everyone to understand I am primarily an animal eater. But I do want us to have the right vision in our head of what that ancestral dietary past was like, and the role that plants played. It wasn't that we were eating animals and then we started incorporating some plants here and there. We were eating plants and bugs and then started eating meat. But so we've always been eating plants. But here's the thing. The plants that we were eating, right, by default, I mean, we're talking about a time period where we had very low nutritional needs. Our bodies were small, our brains were small, and we had no technologies whatsoever to assist us in getting food, and then to assist us in processing it before we ate it. So we relied solely on our bodies. So everybody listening, imagine we shrunk you down to 3.5 feet tall. Everything shrunk in proportion. The only difference is that your guts would proportionally be a little bit bigger, your teeth would be a little bit bigger proportionally. But other than that, we're, muscles smaller, all these things smaller, and said, go eat. And with just your nails and your teeth and whatever, with no greenhouses, and there isn't anything, no grocery stores, there's no shipping from Argentina into, another part of the world at a different season. So you were forced by default to eat hyper seasonally and hyper local. All plants have some sort of a toxin. So those that have toxins that were too toxic to consume without processing were not even on your radar. You couldn't touch them. You couldn't eat from those resources. So you were only eating the things that were growing there when they were available for you to eat them, that had a lower toxin load, and it required absolutely no processing at all. It's a very little amount of food. I'm convinced the most nutrient-dense bioavailable components of the diets at that time period were insects. Mm-hmm. Then, that's millions, it's 5 million years ago, 7 million years ago. Then we hit 3.5 million years ago, where we start making tools, allowing our ancestors to butcher scavenged animals. They're introducing meat and a little bit of marrow into their diets, which is fantastic. And then, obviously things change when we start to hunt, and then we can, we become the predators, and we have first access to the entire animal, including the most nutrient dense bioavailable parts of blood, the fat, and the organs. And that's when everything starts to change. So we were eating plants, we were eating fruits, hyper seasonally, hyper locally, the lowest toxin loads possible, which was very, very limited. It wasn't, please don't get this image in your head that, or anybody listening, that when you walk into the produce section of the grocery store, that's what it was like for our early, gatherer ancestors. It was nothing like that at all, because there's no seasons in the grocery store. The cool thing is when you're eating like that, and throughout our prehistory, there's so many just natural limiting mechanisms to stop you from over consuming, especially plants that have toxins that can build up over time. Even if there was a plant that had like something like oxalates in it, for example, you only have access to it for a week or two out of the year. And you maybe consume, something like some oxalates for 2 weeks, and then all of a sudden you're not eating any for a certain period of time, and your body has time to release. So there's those sorts of things happening. But now nuts, for example, we eat so many nuts today because we can go to the big box grocery store and buy a huge bag of shelled, ready to eat nuts for $10, and you can eat them by the handful. And if I said to you, I think, oh my God, I'm eating this amazing keto diet, I'm eating all these nuts, and this is how people ate in the past too, and this is fantastic. It's nothing like how people ate nuts in the past. If I said, here's 2 rocks, go out to that tree, pick up all the nuts, take the holes off the nuts, shell all the nuts, pick all the pieces out of the nuts, and then eat the nuts, you're eating a little bit like this for the entire day. You're not eating handfuls of them. So these limiting mechanisms that prevented our ancestors from getting really sick from some of these foods are no longer limiting mechanisms for us. We don't have seasons in the grocery store anymore. We don't have that localness in the grocery stores anymore. We're touting incredibly dangerous plants as superfoods and eating massive quantities of them, and then making them super cheap. And then we can eat them 2 or 3 times a day, for 365 days out of the year, and causing all of these sorts of issues. That isn't the way people were eating plants in the past. I am convinced. The other cool thing about animal resources compared to plant resources is that animal resources are available all year round, like all year round, no matter where you are in the world. Now, certainly animals migrate, right? And it's easier to get different animals at different times, right? But animals in general are always available. There are some changes, right? There are fat stores change, depending on the season and those sorts of things. What's interesting about fat, though, is that visceral fat, the fat that's like, the stuff that we, belly fat sort of thing, that does change throughout the season. So a deer right now, white-tailed deer here in Maryland right now, a couple months ago would be very, very lean. Right now, they're starting to put on fat to get them through the winter. At the end of the winter, they're very lean again. But an animal will die of starvation before it eats its marrow stores. I mean, there's always marrow in the bones. There's always bone grease in the bones, which you can get out through boiling. So this idea of eating very lean animals in the middle of or in the hot areas is not true if you're accessing all those other fats. Animals are available all year round. Plants are only available at certain times of the year when you're eating wild plants. And again, that's different than the way that we consume them at the grocery store today.
And they're poisonous. And so that's a good thing.
And they're poisonous. And they're poisonous.